Beneath the royal crypts of Spain rests a monarch whose passing birthed one of Europe's most grotesque legends. Ferdinand VII, once called the Desired One by his subjects, would become known for something far more disturbing than his tyrannical rule. As disease and excess ravaged his body, whispers slithered through the Spanish court about an obsession that would define his final years and spawn a macabre tale destined to outlive his crumbling empire. This is the tale of a king who feared the loss of his masculinity more than the loss of his throne, and whose desperate final act would transform him from a feared despot into history's most humiliated monarch. The year was 1833, and Ferdinand VII lay dying within Madrid's royal palace. Yet the king's ultimate concerns were not of succession, diplomacy, or the state of his realm. According to court rumors that would persist for generations, his dying thoughts centered on preserving proof of his manhood for posterity. What would emerge from those deathbed chambers became one of the most bizarre and degrading royal legends ever recorded. A tale of a preserved organ floating in formaldehyde, forever mocking the memory of a once powerful king. Ferdinand VII ascended the Spanish throne in 1808, during one of Europe's most turbulent periods. Spain was caught between Napoleon's ambitions and internal political chaos, with the old Bourbon monarchy struggling to maintain relevance in a rapidly changing world. The young prince's early reign was marked by the Peninsular War, foreign occupation, and the complete upheaval of traditional Spanish society. Initially popular among those who opposed his father Charles IV's weak rule, the young prince would soon reveal himself to be far worse than the monarch he replaced. The political landscape of early 19th century Spain was defined by absolutist traditions clashing with liberal Enlightenment ideals. Ferdinand represented the old guard, a monarch who believed in divine right, absolute power, and the suppression of all democratic movements. His subjects welcomed him as El Deseado, the Desired One, hoping he would restore Spain's former glory and independence. They could not have been more wrong about the character of the man they were crowning. Ferdinand's personality was shaped by years of court intrigue, family betrayal, and personal humiliation during the Napoleonic occupation. These experiences left him paranoid, vindictive, and obsessed with demonstrating his power and masculinity to a world that had repeatedly diminished him. The psychological wounds from his early years would manifest in increasingly disturbing ways as he aged, creating the conditions for the obsessions that would define his later life. The Spanish Empire during Ferdinand's reign was already in steep decline, having lost most of its American colonies and much of its international prestige. This context of national humiliation may have intensified Ferdinand's personal insecurities about his own power and masculinity. As his empire crumbled around him, his focus increasingly turned inward toward more personal and intimate concerns about his legacy and physical prowess. Ferdinand VII quickly established himself as one of Europe's most brutal absolute monarchs, earning the hatred of liberals, intellectuals, and anyone who dared question his authority. His reign was characterized by the systematic persecution, torture, and execution of political opponents. The Inquisition, abolished during the liberal period, was restored with Ferdinand's enthusiastic support, becoming a tool for eliminating anyone suspected of harboring democratic ideals. The king's paranoia extended to every aspect of Spanish society. Universities were purged of liberal professors. Newspapers were shut down or heavily censored, and a vast network of spies and informants monitored the population for signs of dissent. Ferdinand seemed to take personal pleasure in the suffering of his enemies, often attending executions and public punishments. This sadistic streak would later manifest in more intimate and disturbing ways as his physical condition deteriorated. Throughout the 1820s, Ferdinand's rule became increasingly erratic and cruel. The failed liberal revolution of 1820 to 1823 only intensified his persecution of any suspected opponents. Mass executions, imprisonment without trial, and torture became routine tools of governance. The king's court became a place of fear and sycophancy where courtiers competed to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly elaborate displays of submission and flattery. As Ferdinand aged, his cruelty took on more personal dimensions. Court observers noted his growing obsession with loyalty oaths, public demonstrations of submission, and elaborate ceremonies designed to reinforce his absolute authority. These rituals seemed to provide the aging king with a psychological satisfaction that his failing body could no longer deliver through traditional means. The monarch who had once commanded armies now found his power concentrated in the ability to humiliate and degrade those around him. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand VI's body began showing the effects of decades of excess, stress, and poor health. Contemporary accounts describe a monarch who had grown grotesquely obese, suffered from various skin conditions, and experienced increasing difficulty with basic physical functions. His face, once considered handsome in his youth, became bloated and disfigured by illness and overindulgence. The king, who had prided himself on his masculine appearance, was transforming into a physical caricature of royal decadence. Court physicians documented Ferdinand's declining health with growing alarm. He suffered from what modern doctors would likely diagnose as diabetes, heart disease, and various complications related to his obesity and lifestyle. More troubling for the king were the increasingly obvious signs of sexual dysfunction and impotence. For a monarch whose legitimacy partly depended on producing heirs and demonstrating masculine vitality, these physical failures represented an existential crisis. Ferdinand's response to his physical decline was to become increasingly obsessed with proving his masculinity through other means. He demanded that court ceremonies emphasize his virility and power, commissioned portraits that exaggerated his physical attributes, and insisted on detailed medical examinations that would document his continuing potency. Palace servants reported the king's growing preoccupation with his appearance and sexual capabilities, often spending hours examining himself in mirrors and demanding reassurance from physicians about his condition. The psychological impact of his physical decline cannot be overstated. Ferdinand had built his identity around being a powerful, masculine ruler who commanded respect through strength and fear. As his body failed him, his desperation to maintain this image intensified. Court observers noted increasingly erratic behavior, sudden rages followed by periods of deep depression, and an obsessive attention to any perceived slight or challenge to his masculine authority. Ferdinand's marital history reflected his growing anxieties about masculinity and succession. His first 3 wives died without producing surviving male heirs, creating a crisis of legitimacy that haunted the later years of his reign. Each failed marriage intensified his personal insecurities and his desperate need to prove his continued virility. The pressure to produce an heir became intertwined with his declining sexual function, creating a vicious cycle of anxiety and failure. His 4th marriage to Maria Cristina of Naples in 1829 was viewed by many as a last desperate attempt to secure the succession and prove his continuing potency. The king, now in his mid-40s and significantly overweight and unhealthy, struggled to consummate this marriage successfully. Court gossip, of which the king was acutely aware, speculated openly about his sexual capabilities and the likelihood of producing an heir at his advanced age and poor health. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 provided Ferdinand with some relief but also created new anxieties. Having only a female heir in a society that questioned women's ability to rule effectively meant that Ferdinand's masculine legacy remained in doubt. He desperately wanted a male heir but was increasingly unable to perform the necessary functions to create one. This failure became a source of profound psychological torment that affected his behavior and decision-making. Ferdinand's treatment of his wife, Maria Cristina, reflected his sexual anxieties and growing paranoia. He subjected her to invasive medical examinations, insisted on monitoring her every interaction with male courtiers, and demanded detailed reports about her fertility and sexual responsiveness. The royal bedroom became a site of medical intervention and psychological torment, with physicians regularly examining both spouses and reporting on their sexual compatibility and performance. As Ferdinand's health continued to decline in his final years, his desperate attempts to prove and preserve his masculinity became increasingly bizarre and pathetic. He consulted with a parade of physicians, quacks, and supposed miracle healers, seeking treatments that would restore his sexual function and masculine appearance. The royal treasury funded expensive and often dangerous medical procedures, exotic remedies, and elaborate treatments that promised to reverse the aging process. Court records from this period reveal a king obsessed with documenting and preserving evidence of his masculine capabilities. He commissioned detailed medical reports about his physical condition, insisted on measurements and examinations that would supposedly prove his continuing virility, and demanded that physicians provide written testimony about his sexual prowess. These documents were carefully preserved in the royal archives, suggesting that Ferdinand was already planning for his posthumous reputation. The king's behavior during his final years became increasingly erratic and embarrassing to those around him. He would subject visitors to uncomfortable discussions about his sexual capabilities, demand that courtiers acknowledge his continuing attractiveness and masculine appeal, and fly into rages when anyone suggested that his health was failing. Foreign diplomats reported being shocked by the Spanish king's inappropriate behavior and obvious psychological distress. Ferdinand's desperation reached new heights as he realized that his death was approaching. Palace servants reported the king's growing obsession with his physical legacy and his increasing demands that his body be examined and documented by medical professionals. He seemed determined to leave behind proof that he had been a virile, masculine ruler, even as his actual condition made such claims increasingly absurd. In September 1833, as Ferdinand VII lay dying from what physicians diagnosed as a combination of ailments related to his lifestyle and declining health, the most disturbing chapter of his reign began to unfold. According to court rumors that would persist for generations, the dying king made a request so bizarre and degrading that it would define his historical legacy more than any of his political achievements or failures. Witnesses claimed that Ferdinand, in his final delirium, became obsessed with the idea that his enemies would claim he had died as less than a man. His years of sexual dysfunction, impotence, and physical decline had apparently created such deep psychological wounds that even approaching death could not diminish his desperate need to prove his masculinity. The specific details of his final request would become the subject of whispered conversations in royal courts across Europe. According to the persistent legend, Ferdinand VII requested that his male organ be preserved after his death as proof of his masculine capabilities. This grotesque final act was supposedly intended to silence critics who had questioned his virility and to provide physical evidence for future generations that he had been a complete man. The request allegedly came during his final days when fever and medication had perhaps loosened his inhibitions and revealed his deepest anxieties. The reaction of those present to this supposed final request was reportedly one of shock and horror. Even in an age when royal behavior was often eccentric and disturbing, Ferdinand's alleged obsession with preserving his genitalia struck observers as particularly pathetic and degrading. The dying king's inability to distinguish between political legacy and sexual prowess revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration and the extent to which his personal insecurities had consumed his identity as a monarch. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, at the age of 48, leaving behind a legacy of tyranny, failure, and personal humiliation that would be remembered long after his political achievements were forgotten. His death marked the end of absolute monarchy in Spain and the beginning of a new era of liberal government. But for Ferdinand, the most lasting legacy would not be political. It would be the grotesque rumors that emerged from his deathbed. The legend of Ferdinand's preserved organ spread rapidly through European society, becoming a source of both fascination and disgust among those who heard it. According to the persistent rumors, the king's final request had been carried out, and somewhere in the depths of the royal palace, a jar containing the monarch's genitalia floated in formaldehyde as a testament to his desperate need for masculine validation. Whether or not the preservation actually occurred, the story itself became a powerful symbol of Ferdinand's pathetic final years and his complete failure as both a king and a man. The image of the once feared tyrant reduced to having his manhood preserved in a jar captured perfectly the absurdity and degradation of his reign. The king who had terrorized Spain for decades would be remembered primarily for this final act of desperate humiliation. The spread of this legend was facilitated by the hatred that Ferdinand had earned during his reign. His former subjects, who had suffered under his tyranny, found a kind of poetic justice in the story of their tormentor's final humiliation. The preserved organ became a symbol of divine retribution, the tyrant king reduced to a grotesque curiosity, his legacy floating in preservative fluid rather than residing in the hearts and minds of a grateful nation. The story of Ferdinand VII's preserved genitalia became one of the most persistent and widespread legends in European royal history. Passed down through generations of courtiers, historians, and gossips, it was the perfect symbol of royal decadence and masculine insecurity. The tale was embellished and modified over time, with various versions claiming different details about the preservation process, the location of the jar, and the reactions of those who supposedly witnessed it. This legend served multiple cultural functions in post-Ferdinand Spain and throughout Europe. For Spanish liberals, it represented perfect justice, the tyrant who had oppressed them, reduced to a pathetic joke about masculine inadequacy. For other European courts, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and personal obsession. The story became a favorite among those who wanted to criticize monarchical excess and the psychological damage caused by unlimited authority. The persistence of this legend also reflects broader cultural anxieties about masculinity, power, and mortality that resonated with audiences across different periods and societies. Ferdinand's supposed obsession with preserving proof of his manhood spoke to universal fears about aging, sexual decline, and the loss of masculine identity. The grotesque nature of his alleged final request made it both memorable and symbolic of deeper human weaknesses. Over time, the story of Ferdinand's preserved organ became detached from its historical context and transformed into a broader cultural myth about the dangers of vanity, the absurdity of power, and the ultimate futility of trying to control one's legacy after death. The king who had desperately wanted to be remembered as a masculine, powerful ruler instead became a figure of ridicule whose name was associated with one of the most humiliating legends in royal history. From a historical perspective, the legend of Ferdinand VI's preserved genitalia reveals more about the cultural attitudes and psychological dynamics of early 19th century European society than it does about the actual events surrounding the king's death. Whether or not the preservation actually occurred, the persistence and widespread acceptance of the story demonstrate the degree to which Ferdinand had failed as a monarch and the extent to which his subjects desired his humiliation. Modern historians approach this legend with appropriate skepticism, noting that many of the details come from unreliable sources and that the story may have been exaggerated or entirely fabricated by Ferdinand's enemies. However, the historical evidence does support the broader narrative of Ferdinand's physical decline, sexual dysfunction, and growing psychological instability during his final years. Contemporary medical records and court observations confirm that the king suffered from various ailments that would have affected his sexual function and physical appearance. The psychological profile that emerges from historical records is consistent with someone who might have been obsessed with preserving proof of his masculinity. Ferdinand's documented paranoia, his desperate attempts to maintain absolute power despite obvious failures, and his increasing focus on personal rather than political concerns all suggest a man whose identity was deeply invested in masculine performance and public perception. What makes this legend particularly significant from a historical standpoint is how it encapsulates the broader themes of Ferdinand's reign and the transition from absolute to constitutional monarchy in Spain. The king's alleged final obsession with his physical legacy perfectly symbolizes his inability to understand the changing nature of political authority and his failure to adapt to new expectations about royal behavior and responsibility. The story of Ferdinand VI's final humiliation serves as a powerful reminder of how personal obsessions and psychological weaknesses can ultimately define a historical legacy more powerfully than political achievements or failures. The king who had ruled Spain with an iron fist, who had restored the Inquisition and persecuted thousands of political opponents, is now remembered primarily for a grotesque legend about his preserved genitalia floating in a jar. This transformation of Ferdinand's legacy from that of a feared tyrant to a pathetic figure of ridicule demonstrates the ultimate futility of trying to control one's historical reputation through force and intimidation. The king's desperate attempts to preserve proof of his masculinity backfired spectacularly, creating a legend that made him appear weaker and more pathetic than any of his political failures could have managed. The persistence of this humiliating legend also reflects the power of popular culture and oral tradition to shape historical memory in ways that formal historical records cannot. While official histories might focus on Ferdinand's political decisions and their consequences, the story that has endured in popular consciousness is one of personal degradation and psychological collapse. For contemporary observers, Ferdinand VI's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal insecurities and obsessions to override rational judgment and appropriate behavior. The king's inability to accept his physical limitations and aging process led him down a path of increasingly desperate and ultimately self-destructive actions that destroyed whatever positive legacy he might have hoped to leave behind. The legend of Ferdinand VII stands as one of history's most vivid examples of how personal psychological dysfunction can transform a powerful ruler into a figure of lasting ridicule and contempt. Whether or not the grotesque details of his final request actually occurred, the story has endured because it perfectly captures the absurdity and tragedy of a man whose desperate need to prove his masculinity ultimately destroyed any possibility of being remembered with dignity or respect. Ferdinand's tale resonates across centuries because it speaks to universal human fears about aging, inadequacy, and the loss of power and virility. His extreme response to these common anxieties, allegedly requesting that his genitals be preserved as proof of his manhood, represents the ultimate failure of psychological coping mechanisms and the complete collapse of judgment and perspective that can result from unchecked insecurity and vanity. The king, who had terrorized Spain for decades, who had commanded armies and controlled the lives of millions, was ultimately undone not by military defeat or political revolution, but by his own inability to accept the natural limitations of human mortality and physical decline. His desperate attempt to control his posthumous reputation through the preservation of his sexual organs resulted in exactly the opposite of what he intended: eternal humiliation and ridicule. In the end, Ferdinand VI's legacy serves as a powerful reminder that true strength and masculine dignity come not from desperate attempts to prove one's virility or power, but from the ability to face life's challenges and limitations with grace, wisdom, and acceptance. The king who could not accept his own mortality and physical decline became immortal in the worst possible way, as a cautionary tale about the price of allowing personal insecurities to consume one's identity and judgment. The jar that allegedly contained Ferdinand's preserved organ, whether real or imaginary, became a perfect metaphor for his entire reign, a grotesque spectacle preserved in formaldehyde, serving as a permanent reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, personal obsession, and the ultimate futility of trying to control one's legacy through force, intimidation, or desperate final gestures. The king who wanted to be remembered as a powerful, masculine ruler instead became history's most humiliated monarch, his name forever associated with one of the most degrading legends in European royal history.